We looked at sources of greenhouse gas emissions and we looked at a Kaya identity, both to interpret trends in past greenhouse gas emissions and to construct scenarios of future greenhouse gas emissions. Let's now have a look at options to reduce emissions. The starting point is again the Kaya identity, which you see repeated here. Emissions E equals the number of people times per capita income times the energy intensity of the economy times the carbon intensity of the primary energy supply. Now, if this is true, then we can also take the log on both sides of the equation. And then we have this expression here, where of course the multiplication that we see here becomes an addition after we've taken the log. This is true, and therefore this must be true as well. The next step what we can do is take on both sides of the equation the first partial derivative to time. So d ln E is 1 over E, that's the first partial derivative of log E, times dE dt. This is just chain rule. dE dt is commonly written as E dot. And what we have here is that this is the change in E, and this is E itself. So this is the proportional growth rate of E. Now this applies to d ln E dt, but it also applies to all the other things. So what we have is that the growth rate of emissions equals the growth rate of the population plus the growth rate of per capita income plus the growth rate of energy intensity of the economy plus the growth rate of the carbon intensity of the energy supply. And because this is true, this is true as well. And this gives us our 4 basic options to reduce emissions. The first one, if you want E to fall, that's emission reduction, this term should go negative. That implies that the sum of these 4 terms should go negative. So the first option that you have is to reduce population growth. Now this is not something that politicians in democratic countries like to talk about. They think that this is something for people to decide for themselves. This is not something that politicians should interfere with. That is true for democratic countries. It's not true for a country like Zimbabwe, which has an active policy of scaring people out of the country, or for a country like Sudan, which has an active policy of killing as many people it doesn't like as possible. But also China has for a very long time during the international climate negotiations argued that its one-child policy is its major contribution to greenhouse gas emission reduction to international climate policy. That is a nonsense claim because the one-child policy came into force a long time before people started worrying about climate change, and it was introduced for reasons that had nothing to do with climate change or emission reduction, but that didn't stop the Chinese government to make this claim and make this claim repeatedly. But by and large, people would argue that reducing population growth on behalf of the climate or to avoid climate change is not a viable option. There are, of course, a few environmentalists like George Monbiot who argue like this, but it's very much a minority position. Now, if we cannot touch P, or the growth rate of the population, that means that the rest will have to do the trick. So the second thing that you can do is to reduce economic growth. Again, that is not something that politicians are keen to propose. And even in dictatorships, that is not, or very autocratic countries, typically politicians argue that the economy should grow. The only exception really is the Brexit governments of the UK. That's the only country in the world that I can think of that has an active policy of shrinking the economy. That is, of course, not to say that this would not be an effective policy and that economic shrink does not occasionally happen. This is a very recent example. This is the first 5 months of the year 2020. Looking here is emissions of CO2 from fossil fuel combustion over the last 50 years or so. And you see a steady increase, and then at the very end it sort of collapses. And here, this particular period is blown up, and you see indeed that emissions have fallen, and have fallen quite substantially, some 17%, maybe 16% in 5 months' time. And this is, of course, because of the shutdown that had to do with the coronavirus pandemic. There's also structural changes where sometimes an economy collapses. And here we're looking at results from the former Soviet Union, where in the orangey browny color, the solid line, you're looking at CO2 emissions, and the dotted blue line, you're looking at gross domestic product in what was then the Soviet Union, the USSR, and then in the late 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed politically and subsequently economically. You see the economy take a dive, and you see that emissions follow almost in lockstep. The Russian economy by then started recovering 1997, 1998, but you also see that actually CO2 emissions did not follow, and that is because the very similar growth between GDP and CO2 that you see here is because a lot of economic activity in these countries was heavy industry. Heavy industry collapsed, the economy collapsed, both CO2 emissions and the economy came down. But the rapid growth that you see from the mid-1990s onwards, the rapid economic growth, was mostly in other sectors rather than heavy manufacturing. And that is why CO2 emissions went up, but not nearly by as much. The takeaway message here is that yes, economic shrink is a very effective policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but of course it comes at enormous economic pain, and that is why few people would advocate this particular option. I say few because there are a few crazies out there that say that this is what we should be doing, but this is not nearly anywhere near a mainstream position.